is Find the Intersections Bible Study Method, and it's good to be with you today. The way this works is there are passages 4 days a week, and Monday is a gospel, Tuesday is a New Testament passage, Wednesday is an Old Testament, Thursday is a psalm, and then Friday we find the theme or the thread or the intersection that runs through those four passages. And today we're going to begin kind of talking about how this works, and we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 to 30. And this particular passage is, it's a parable, so we have to recognize that it's a story form, and we shouldn't take this literal. And with all of Jesus' parables, it has a message. And so I encourage you to read Matthew chapter 25. Verses 14 to 30. In fact, I would encourage you to kind of take a look at what comes before, because this is a series of parables that all deal with the master leaving and the servants being entrusted with responsibility. And so that's what we get today. So here's a summary. So Jesus tells a story about a wealthy man who entrusts some of his wealth to his servants. Two of them increase the money, while one simply buries the money and gives it back when the master returns. And the master's angry and rejects the third servant, giving his small amount of money to the servant who made the most. So that's kind of a summary of it. So let's take a look at the passage. I want to notate the very first verse in this passage would be Matthew chapter 25, verse 14 says, "The kingdom of heaven is like ... And so the context of this parable is the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he gives an example using this parable. The kingdom of heaven is God's kingdom. It's God's kingdom, his will being done on earth as it is in heaven. It's no more pain, no more tears, no more death. That's his will. It's being implemented, and it's like a master who goes away. So when you step back from this a little bit, we see that this is taking place in Act 5 of the story of God. This is the church that's living out the work of the kingdom, the work of Jesus, waiting for Jesus to come home. So that's kind of where this is taking place. This is an anticipation of the second coming of Jesus. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. God, the master, entrusts the servants with resources. It specifically talks about money, but I do not think that Jesus was only talking about money. I believe he was talking about the resources that are gifted to us, the things that he entrusts to us, which would include our time and include our talents, our gifts, our skills, right? It would include our money. It would include the body that we have, and it would include our relationships, time, talents, treasures, temple, trust, the 5 T's of stewardship, right? And so God entrusts us, and the master entrusts these servants. And what do they do with it? Well, there is the benefit we see at the end here that those that invested in God's kingdom received more responsibility. And the second is they received the joy of being in God's presence. And so they had a motivation to work and serve in the kingdom of the master. And there was benefits to that. They were motivated. They had to risk, they had responsibility, and they invested in God's kingdom, and it was fruitful. Now, this would include, as we take a look at it, this would include our maybe our relationships in our marriage, our success, our influence, our responsibility, our property, our skills. All of those things would kind of fall under that idea of stewardship. Now, when you go to the third servant, it gets interesting, because the third servant isn't motivated by risk and responsibility and spending time with the master. The third servant is motivated by fear, and fear becomes like a prison for this particular servant. The fear of the master is what keeps this particular servant focusing on safety and security instead of risk and responsibility. And so this particular servant buries the talent. And by the way, talent equals about 20 years. One coin is about 20 years' wages. So we're talking enormous responsibility, and the servant buries it. and then when the master comes back, it wasn't invested. And so what this servant did was motivated by fear, and fear is in a prison. It paralyzes us. Kind of the what if questions and the maybes of life paralyze us so that we don't act and don't invest. And so the third servant faces the consequences of being motivated by fear. And the third servant is cast out from the presence of the master, and also loses this responsibility as being a steward of God. And by the way, steward kind of goes back to Adam, who was called to be a steward of God's resources. So this particular idea is a restoration of the calling of Adam upon these servants, and a byproduct would be us. So here we are, we read this passage, we say, what does it really mean to us? And we see that God entrusts us with resources, and what are we going to do with them? And this idea of working for the kingdom requires risk. And so we have to have the courage to do the things that God is calling us and asking us to do to build his kingdom. And so that is a question for all of us. Or will we be motivated by fear? Will we be motivated by the fear of disappointing the master? And I know a lot of people who are kind of hunkering down because they're afraid. And we understand as we read the parables, Jesus is the perfect representation of God. And so we can't necessarily take this master story literally in the sense of the master being mean and angry, even though God is judge. But we have to understand that we don't need to be afraid, because as John says, perfect love casts out all fear. So we can understand that God is love, and this master represents this entrusting God who gives us the gifts and resources to invest in God's kingdom. So what will we do with those resources? Will we bury them out of fear, or will we use them to build God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven that he's talking about here? Because Jesus is going to come back, and he is going to ask us what we did with the resources he gave us. And I believe that's what we refer to as judgment. And I want to be found faithful in that, and I hope you do too. So first day of Intersections for Sandy Hook, peeps. And I hope that this was a beneficial. I'd like you to share in the comments what you got out of the passage. And hey, I will try to be back tomorrow, and we'll talk about 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. So you guys take care. Grace and peace, everyone. See ya.